Welcome, class. This is the lecture on Chapter 6 about listening. Why do we listen? Listening is an essential part of communication because that is how we receive and interpret messages. Without that, communication really doesn't happen because we're only sending messages. Communication necessitates receiving messages as well, and that's what we do when we listen. Here we're going to talk about active listening, and there are a number of definitions we're going to talk about. So let's talk about hearing, and that's the passive physiological act of receiving sound into your eardrums. And then listening is more of an active process of we receive those messages, we interpret them, we respond to that symbolic activity, that language. All right, now let's talk about the steps of active listening. So receiving is the first step. That's where messages are coming in, where we process them. And then the next step is attending. And that's when we decide what to focus on. Third, we're going to interpret. And that's kind of assigning meaning to sounds and symbolic activity. And then finally, we're going to respond to and continue the cycle of we receive a message, and then we're going to respond and send our own message. And then kind of the last part that kind of goes to the side of the listening process, not directly involved in it, is reflecting. And that might be at the end of a conversation, or it might be at the end of a phrase. But that's where we just summarize to ourselves what was the gist of that message? Like, what did they want me to get out of that? And that's reflecting or paraphrasing. Engaged listening is about the highest form of listening we can do. So active listening, we're involved in the process, we're going through, we're interpreting messages, and we're sending feedback. Engaged listening takes it one step further, where we're not only doing all those things of active listening, but we're also looking at it from the perspective of the person sending the message. And so that helps us create a shared meaning and understanding, which elevates our listening process. Now, disengaged listening is sort of the opposite. Like, for example, if someone just casually walks by and says, "How are you doing?" Standard response is like, "Good." It's things like that that you don't actually really want the person isn't really looking for an answer, and you're not really sending one. It's just like a pre-programmed response that you're not engaging with that person. You're just the standard response. Like if you're in a Spanish-speaking country, it's like buenos dias, buenos tardes. If you walk by someone and say buenos tardes, they will just instantly respond buenos tardes without thinking, without continuing any conversation, just those words and done. That's what disengaged listening is. Now, relational listening is the idea of recognizing and making the connections between different things while we're listening. And so that's relationships, that's how things fit together. That's what we're talking about when we talk about relational listening. Person-centered listening is the idea of really kind of compassionate, empathetic listening. So this is how you might listen to someone who's having a hard time. So you are going to show them respect. You're not going to think less about them. You're going to try to be empathetic and understand where they're coming from. Try to be genuine with and really listen to what it is they're saying. And you're not going to judge them based on what it is they have to say. You're just going to really support them and help them through that process. And that's what person-centered listening is. We'll be talking about critical listening over the next couple of slides. And critical listening is an important skill because it helps us really look at a message and decide if if it's real, if it's valuable, or if it's inaccurate, if it's false. So critical listening isn't like critical, like we're just being negative about a message we receive. It's about turning on that critical thinking part of your brain and evaluating the message for legitimacy. There are 5 parts to critical listening that help us evaluate the legitimacy of a message. The first question we're going to ask ourselves is this message plausible? Could it be real? And if it passes that, let's move on to the other steps. The next, let's evaluate the source. Is this a source that is likely to supply us with legitimate information? Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe it's inconsistent. That's something to keep in mind as we go through the other steps. The next we're going to look at is the evaluation of their arguments. One of the things I think about when we evaluate the arguments is the people with the belief that the earth is flat. Now, they have a number of arguments, but when it comes to actual testing, these arguments are proven to be illegitimate. They don't work. But when they do like scientific tests, it shows that indeed the earth is not flat. It is round, spherical in nature. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is consistency. Are they consistent throughout with their message? Now, this is like the idea with a TV show or a story or a book of plot holes. Does everything work? But is there something in there that like this just doesn't work the way it is? And that might show us that this isn't legitimate. This isn't actually how it is. And then finally, we're going to evaluate the evidence. If it was an experiment, is it repeatable? That's what we're asking when we're evaluating the evidence. If someone else were to be in the same situation with the same information or the same information, would the results be the same? Evaluate the evidence. We're looking for verifiability to indicate that the material can be confirmed by other sources and other means. There are a number of issues that come up with listening and problems that get in the way of effective listening. Let's talk about them. There's a whole list, so buckle up. We've got environmental distractions. So an example of that would be like you're trying to have a conversation during a loud concert. There's music, people are yelling, screaming, singing along, and it's really hard to hear what the other person is saying. A medium distraction would be the idea of being in a video call with a poor connection, where occasionally you lose what the person's saying because the call is frozen, and you kind of lose out on bits and pieces of the conversation that way. A source distraction is the idea that it's hard to understand the sender of the message, that whether that's they're pausing constantly, they're not being direct with what they're saying, or they have a thick accent, or they don't speak the language very well, something that makes it hard to understand what they're saying. A factual diversion is someone who goes off on so many tangents that you lose the main idea of what you're talking about. Semantic diversion is the idea of the listener being caught up on something and having a strong negative response to something that the sender of the message has said, that they kind of get distracted and hung up on that, and they lose track of the main point of the conversation. Now, content listening is the reason we have a picture of Drax here on this slide, and that is the idea of being very literal, where you're missing the underlying concepts and you're just going for exactly what is said in the conversation. Now, selective listening is the idea of picking and choosing only the parts of the conversation that are meaningful to you. Egocentric listening is the idea of putting yourself ahead. So if someone's talking to you, in egocentric listening would be the idea of they tell you about this whole thing and you respond with yourself. not with, doesn't necessarily have to be on topic, but yourself instead of, you're diverting all the attention to yourself. That's egocentric listening. Now, wandering thoughts is pretty self-explanatory. You kind of get lost while they're talking and stop paying attention. Experiential superiority is the idea of kind of a know-it-all, where because you've been through it, you've done this before, you kind of disregard the sender's message in favor of your own experience. Another possible problem is message complexity. So an example of this is if someone wants to have a discussion about theoretical physics during an entry-level communications class, it's very unlikely that anyone's going to follow the conversation well unless they have a background in theoretical physics. A lot of it's just going to, without the foundational things, it's just going to not mean anything to them. It's just going to be terms and ideas that don't stick because they have no connection to them. And then finally, the last problem we're going to discuss, the last thing that might impact our ability to listen well and receive the message in its completely, is past experience with the source, where we've had an experience where they've been unreliable, we have previous relationship with them that negatively impacts the way we listen to them. All right, there are 5 main objectives when we are listening. We are first trying to develop and enhance relationships. The second thing we want to do is we want to be gaining and comprehending information. The third we talked about earlier is critical listening. We want to be evaluating the legitimacy of what's being said. Fourth is for enjoyment and appreciation. It's hard to have an enjoyable conversation if it's one-sided. And the fifth one is therapeutic listening. If we're going to really have that therapeutic, that kind of conversation, listening needs to be involved with that if we're going to have a successful therapeutic experience. And finally, we've made it to the end, and we'll see you in the next one.